Good morning. Welcome to the Boise Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I'm the Reverend Sara LaWall. It is my great honor to serve this beloved community, and we are so glad that you've joined us for our online worship service this morning. Whether you are Zooming in with us from just down the street or from across the city or from another state, we are so glad you are here. Whoever you are and wherever you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. Whoever you love and however you identify, you are welcome here. Whatever faiths you have known, if any, you are welcome here. A special welcome to any newcomers out there, those of you that are brand new this morning or have been worshiping with us for just a few weeks. We know that it takes a lot of courage to join a new community, but we're so glad that our virtual services are drawing new people to us every week. We invite you, if you're comfortable, to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat so our community can welcome you. And to fill out the newcomer form, we'll post a link for that in the chat as well, so that we can connect with you and keep you updated on all of the ways that we are gathering in this virtual time. And there are many. I want to highlight just a few announcements. Tomorrow evening, our racial justice team and climate action team come together to host an Indigenous Peoples Day program at 7 p.m. And our climate action team hosts a climate action forum focused on agriculture, a statewide forum partnering with Citizens Climate Lobby, featuring our own John O'Connor as the keynote speaker. That's Saturday the 24th at 10 a.m. Details to both of those events can be found at our website, boiseuu.org. Our social justice plate partner for this month of October is Catch. Catch is a homelessness services provider here in the Treasure Valley, and they exist because they believe in the vision that everyone deserves a home. Catch, as you know, we have partnered with them for many years now. They work to create safe, healthy, connected community by embracing the housing first model and best practices, rapid rehousing, empowering those without housing, building collaborative partnerships, and increasing public awareness and understanding. Their vision is that we can end homelessness in the Treasure Valley. And it is a joy to be their partner and watch how they house families week after week after week. Catch also is the home to Our Path Home and a visionary leader in the single point entry system for people experiencing homelessness and needing services. They're really leaders in our community, and it is a gift to watch their vision and their mission at work in the world. When I asked their executive director, Stephanie Day, if there were any special projects that our community could do in partnership with them this month, she said they are really in need of cleaning supplies. So in addition to making them our offering plate partner for the month, we want to invite all of you to pull together donations of cleaning supplies, soap, sponges, laundry soap, buckets, baskets. You can drop those off here at the church, and we will make sure that they all get to Catch at the end of the month along with their check. 25% of our unpledged plate offering will go to Catch at the end of the month. Each week, we pause to offer a land acknowledgement, a recognition that the land upon which our church and homes exist is the ancestral land of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute tribes who inhabited a vast region of Idaho and much of the West. We also acknowledge the ancient tribes whose names have been lost to history. We offer this acknowledgement as a recognition of the longer history of the land long before colonization. And we pause to remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and responsible stewardship. May these truths discomfort us, and in that discomfort, may we move through the world, bringing justice in every way that we can, listening to the truths spoken to us by Native American peoples, making space for them to re-inhabit this place and giving them back the resources they need in their communities for healing and repair. Offering a land acknowledgement does not right the many wrongs when it comes to our Western colonial history. It does not wipe the slate clean or let us off the hook in any way, but it does help orient us differently to the terrible truths that are too easy to hide away. It invites our hearts to open, to recognize deep wounds, to listen more deeply, and to offer our gratitude for this land that was never ours. Today's service reflects upon and honors Indigenous Peoples Day, which occurs tomorrow here in Idaho and in a growing number of states across the country. Only last year did Idaho's governor issue an official proclamation honoring Indigenous Peoples Day on a day which previously celebrated Columbus Day, privileging that history of Western, white, European, Christian settlers who declared their takeover and colonial rule was God's will. Thanks to the Indigenous organizing efforts across the nation, we're beginning to recognize and name and repair the harm caused not only by Columbus, but by our lauding of conquest and of the, quote, discovery of a land already inhabited. Today you will hear words and music from a variety of Native voices in celebration of their cultures, their art, and their contribution to history. As we explore our monthly theme of deep listening, may today remind us of the deep listening required of us and long overdue to truly expand our understanding and work toward repair. In that spirit of deep listening, I invite us all to breathe together. To know that as we breathe, we are connected with one another across distance. As we breathe, we are connected to our shared humanity and interdependence. As we breathe, we are connected to this earth. Thou art the song of my heart in the morning. Thou art the dawn of truth in my soul. Thou art the dew of the roses adorning. Thou art the woven whole. Thine is the grace to be steadfast in danger. Thine is the peace that none can destroy. Thine is the face of the need-driven stranger. Thine are the wings of joy. Thou art the deep, to the deep in me calling. Thou art a lamp where my feet shall tread. Thy way is steep past the peril of falling. Thou art my daily bread. Thine be the praise of my spirit uplifted. Thou art the sea to each flowing stream. Thine be the days that are gathered and sifted. Thou art the deathless dream.
Ayohoea, wehana yohoea, he yo hayo hayohoea, hana yohoea he, ayo hayohoea, hana yo hayohoea, yohoea, hana yohoea he. Let's put our minds together as one and remember the ones who passed on to the sky world. Their life duties are complete. They are living peacefully in the sky world. in the sky world. Ayohoea, wehana yohoea, hey yo, hayo, hayo, hoea, hana yohoea, hey. Hayo, hayo, hoea, hana yo, hayo, hoea, yo, hoea, hana yo, hoea, hey. Let's put our minds together as one and remember the ones who've passed on to the sky world. Their life duties are complete. They are living peacefully in the sky world. In the sky world.
Each week, we light our flaming chalice, a symbol of our free faith, a beacon of hope, love, and justice. We join in this lighting in solidarity and community with hundreds of other Unitarian Universalists lighting chalices in homes and in virtual worship spaces, reminding us that we are connected to one another and to a larger community of faith and love. We welcome back our young chalice lighters who ground us in our hope for a brighter future, even in the darkest of times. If you have a chalice nearby, you are invited to light it with our young chalice lighter, Rose Murphy. As we light the chalice from our home on Logger Drive, you are also invited to share in the chat where you have lit your chalice this morning. And if you wish to go to gallery view, you can see everyone holding up their chalices, and we can enjoy community in this way. As we light our collective chalices, we offer you this call to worship from the 2019 U.S. Poet Laureate and member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, Joy Harjo. This is an excerpt from her poem, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings.
1. Set conflict resolution ground rules. Recognize whose lands these are on which we stand. Ask the deer, the turtle, and the crane. Make sure the spirits of these lands are respected and treated with goodwill.
The land is a being who remembers everything. You will have to answer to your children and their children and theirs. The red shimmer of remembering will compel you up to the night to walk the perimeter of truth for understanding.
As I brushed my hair over the hotel sink to get ready, I heard, by listening, we will understand who we are in this holy realm of words. Do not parade, pleased with yourself. You must speak in the language of justice. Come, let us listen. Come, let us speak in the language of justice. Come, let us worship together.
I want to invite everyone to cozy up for our time for all ages. As we listen to our story this morning, I invite you to notice the big wondering questions that come up for you. And I just want to say what an honor and a blessing it is to be gathered today for this service. And I want to announce a couple of events that are coming up in October for our whole community, families, and beyond. So we will be having a puzzle exchange this Saturday, the 17th, in Veterans Memorial Park. This week, I invite everyone to drop off games and puzzles that you have around your house but aren't going to play anymore over here at the north entrance of church, and then we will meet together from 1 to 3. You can drop in from 1 to 3 on Saturday the 17th to browse our community selection and take home a new to you puzzle or game. And then on Halloween, Saturday, October 31st, from 1 to 2, I invite people of all ages to come join a Zoom room to show off your costumes, your pumpkin carvings, and your very best Monster Mash moves. And that is 1 to 2 on Saturday, the 31st on Halloween. So those are our community events. Have you ever wondered how your grandparents' or great-grandparents' childhood impacts you and has shaped your life? Have you ever thought about that? I wonder what was life like for your grandma? Where did her and her siblings go to school? Where did they play? What kind of chores did your grandparents do? And who helped teach them stuff like how to braid or how to read? Our story today covers a really difficult time in our history, a very difficult practice in our history. From George Washington onward, our government and the settlers colonizing this land wanted to civilize Indigenous communities. From 1810 to 1917, our government subsidized or helped pay for boarding schools that took these Indigenous children out of their communities to learn Euro-American practices. In 1891, a law was passed that demanded compulsive attendance of Native children at these boarding or residential schools. They were taken away from their land and their family. They were forced to not use any words from the language they knew, to live away from their families and land for a whole school year from August to May, or even for years on end. They were punished for not following the rules that were unfairly made to make them forget their community's lifestyle and values. Idaho had one of these residential schools in the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. So here's a map of Idaho. And Coeur d'Alene is all the way up here, and that is the reservation. It's the land they were allowed. This boarding school, this residential school, didn't close until 1974, less than 50 years ago. Often these schools were run by religious groups. Unitarians, ancestors of our faith, ran a residential school in Montana focused on assimilating children of the Crow tribe. This is part of the history of the land we live in and the history of our faith and the people who live on this land. Our story this morning is going to help us connect our understanding of history by connecting to the stories of our elders and ancestors. It is called The Train by Jody Callaghan, and it's published by Second Story Press. Ashley was smaller than her sister, but old enough to walk herself to school every morning and back again at the end of the day. She took her time when she walked, kicking dirt to uncover stones and pieces of colored glass, which she kept on a windowsill in her bedroom. The sun was exceptionally bright this afternoon. Ashley had to shield her eyes with a hand to see the road. A car sped past her, billowing up a cloud of dirt. It stung her eyes, and she stopped to wipe them. Squinting, she followed the tire tracks up the road to where the old train station used to stand. A small figure in the grass was in the grass by the tracks. Ashley recognized the way the figure leaned against his cane. She smiled and broke into a run. The beads of her backpack jingled with their tin, and her school books bounced heavy against her back. "Uncle, uncle," she cried. Here she is, giving her uncle a hug. Ashley's uncle turned and greeted her with a smile. "Hello, Tus," he said, extending his good arm to give her a hug. She rushed into him, burrowing her face into his wool jacket. He was warm against her cheek. She inhaled deeply, and he smelled like sage. She pulled away to look up at him. "Uncle, what are you doing here?" The corners of his eyes crinkled, and one side of his mouth turned up in a lopsided smile. Ashley's uncle looked at her, but she could see the light in his eyes. He focused his gaze down the track. The planks of wood between the metal rails were rotting and broken from years of weather damage. It was easy to see the community no longer thought of this place. "I'm waiting for the train," he let out in a small voice. Ashley looked down the tracks too. It was overworked and overgrown with weeds, no longer fit for a train. She giggled. "Uncle, the train doesn't come here anymore." "I know, Tus." He shifted his weight onto his cane, and his smile drooped slowly. "I know." Uncle hobbled over to, apologize for the glare. Uncle hobbled over to a piece of concrete foundation left from the old train station. He sat down and balanced his cane on top of his knees. Ashley followed, sitting in the tall grass by his feet. She plucked up a dandelion, rubbing it against the back of her hand, tracing a heart with the yellow shade. Have you ever done that? Just traced things on your hands? Or with a dandelion? "I'm sad," he said, "because our people have forgotten about this place." He looked down the track. Ashley almost turned to see what he was looking at, but she knew nothing was there. She walked by this place 1,000 times. She focused on her uncle, studying the lines on his small face. Whispers of gray hair fluttered around his head as the wind blew from behind him. And yet he looked young to her right then. "What happened?" she wondered out loud. "This place is very important to me and to people like me," he said proudly. "Why?" she asked. "What could be so important about a weeded over train track?" Uncle clutched his cane in both hands and pointed the rubber end firmly on the ground. He leaned into it and looked at where she sat in the tall grass. See how she looks concerned about her uncle here? And he looks like he's thinking very hard about something. He began. "A long time ago, a train ran through this place. It would come maybe once a month to drop off things like rice and potatoes, stuff from outside the reserve." He took his handkerchief out of his pocket and placed it in his lap, picking at loose threads as he spoke. "Giju would send me and your grandfather, Timmy, down to meet the train because we were the oldest. We would line up here to wait with our baskets, and after we got our rations, we would walk home. Timmy and I would always sneak a potato each on the way. We ate them raw like they were apples." Ashley giggled, thinking about Grandfather Timmy and Uncle as young boys eating raw potatoes. Why do you think they ate raw potatoes? Probably because they were hungry, huh? Rations are what the government used to give Native communities, and they're just little packages of food. Her uncle continued. "One day, Giju sent the 4 oldest children out with baskets. It was early fall, but she made us take our white winter coats. She was crying, and we didn't know why. Giju didn't cry very often, but when she got started, she could not stop. She gave each of us a kiss and sent us to the train station. He looked down at the foundation he was sitting on. When we arrived, there were children from all over the village. I saw my cousin Benny, so I ran up to him and I asked him what was going on, and he didn't know. Uncle pointed to the broken track. The train was already there. A few men were standing with the cargo doors open. They pointed at us and said, "Okay, you first," and then they put us on the train. Ashley wanted to speak, but her uncle's expression stopped her, and he began again. My brother and sister were a bit younger than me, so they got put into a different car. Timmy and I were bigger, and they moved us to the front. When we got to the school, the nuns told us to go inside. They took our clothes, they took our baskets, and they cut off all our hair. They told us we were no longer native, and if we put up a fuss, we were hit, sometimes worse. His voice trailed off into a whisper. We weren't allowed to speak our language. We weren't allowed to be Nunu. Nunu is a word for indigenous. It means to be indigenous. Ashley's uncle picked up his handkerchief and blew his nose. He clutched it tightly in his right hand, and his shoulders trembled softly. Why do you think he was trembling? I think he still feels the pain from what he went through, from the trauma, and I think his body is still reacting to it. I was there for 6 years, he told his niece. I didn't know how to speak any English, so I didn't talk to many people. I was like a little mouse, hiding in my room. He smiled softly. Tears gathered in the corner of his eyes. I tried to be invisible, but they found me. Ashley stared down into the grass. She plucked up a few of the pieces and tied them into knots. Why did they do that? She looked up. The lines in her uncle's face had softened. His eyes were glittering as the sun shone down on his brown skin. Because we were different, he said calmly. Ashley's cheeks grew warmer. She felt angry and confused. Why didn't your mommy and daddy come get you? Why didn't they stop the train? She felt her own tears welling up. Her uncle shrugged. They didn't know. No one knew. But the train changed everything. Were you sad to leave? Ashley asked. He nodded and his voice began to tremble again. There was nobody besides us waving goodbye. There was nobody there to hug us or kiss us, or to remember who we were when we left that day. I'm sorry, Uncle. Ashley choked through her tears. He placed his good hand on her shoulder. It's not your fault, Tus. He lifted her chin and smiled at her. You and your sister make me so happy. When I hear you laugh and I see you run and play, it makes me think that one day everything will be okay. One day we won't be so sad. He paused and looked toward the track for a moment. I wanted you to know where your family has come from, Ashley, so you can be proud of where you're going. Ashley wiped her tears with her sleeve. Is that why you come to the tracks, Uncle? To remember what happened? He nodded and thought for a moment. I come here to remember what happened, but I also come here to wait. What are you waiting for? She asked, craning her neck to look at the tracks, broken and rusted, still in the evening light, just as she had left them. I am waiting for what we lost that day to come back to us. Why? She asked. Because if I don't, who will? He said. He closed his eyes tightly. So So this is all the stuff that he remembers. He remembers the land and the animals. He remembers being with his Giju, being with his family in a boat, eating meals. This is what he is waiting for to come back. All these important connections. Ashley reached up and touched her uncle's fingers. They uncurled, and her hand rested small inside his. He looked at his little niece. She smiled up at him and said, "Don't worry, Uncle. I will wait with you." Can you think of a time when you learned a painful story about someone you love? Have you ever heard from your elders what hopes and dreams they have for you? Have you ever shared with them what hopes you have for a future you'll see? How can we be part of healing the pains and harms of previous generations? And how do we offer healing and hope to the future? I invite our children to join me now in our children's chapel, where we're going to do some interactive worship and we're going to make cards for our elders. So we'll have to grab some supplies. After the service, I invite our youth grades 6 and older to join our youth advisors for their own youth chapel, and it's going to be using the same Zoom room, which will appear on your screen. Adults, I invite you to sing our children to their worship space.
May your mind be open to new learning. May your lips bring truth into the world. May your heart know love and your hands do the work of justice as you go your way in peace. As you go your way in peace.
Thank you, Jem, for that beautiful story. Thank you for sharing with us a story that often doesn't get told. As a community, we are always looking for ways to deepen our own way of being interdependent with one another, with our wider world, looking and seeking ways for justice to emerge in our wider community. Each week, we give of ourselves. We contribute to our weekly offering to give to the greater good, to help support the ministries of this self-sustaining fellowship and the ministry of our plate partner. You can participate in our weekly offering by going to our website, boiseuu.org, and clicking Give at the top of the screen. It's highlighted in yellow and a red heart there on the picture. Fill out the donor information card. 25% of our unpledged plate offering will go to our plate partner Catch at the end of the month. If you'd like your gift to be handled differently, please use the special contribution box and give us some notes in the comment section. Giving is a way that we live out our faith in the world. Giving is a way that we recognize that there is more for us to do than just within these walls. We thank you in advance for your generosity. Our offering will now be received.
Our reading today is an excerpt from the novel Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Silko is a novelist, poet, and essayist of Laguna Pueblo, Mexican and Anglo-American heritage, and a major contributor to the Native American literary and artistic renaissance, which is considered to have begun in the late 1960s. I will tell you something about stories, he said. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories, but the stories cannot be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy because we would be defenseless then. He rubs his belly. I keep it in here, he said. Here, put your hand on it. See, it is moving.
A question I frequently get asked is, how does it feel to be Native American and still be a citizen of the United States of America? I often tell people that it feels like our Native community is an old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party in our house. They've even come upstairs and unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. And we're tired, we're old, we're weak, and we're sick. And so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that is the most painful is that virtually nobody comes upstairs to find the grandmother in the bedroom. Nobody sits down next to us on the bed and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house.
That video by Native American speaker and activist Mark Charles shares a helpful and heartbreaking metaphor. I think the most appropriate response before I launch into my sermon today is thank you. Thank you for letting us live in your house. This is the first service I have ever done, or attended for that matter, focused on Indigenous people. It's not for a lack of interest, but more because of a lack of knowledge and experience. It's hard to admit that I have little exposure to, relationships with, or even knowledge about Indigenous peoples, despite the fact that I come from Southern Arizona, home of several tribal nations, including the Navajo Nation, one of the largest tribes in the US. I name this lack of knowledge and experience as both a failure and an opportunity to course correct, and to seek out ways to connect with and deepen my relationships with Indigenous people, my understanding of Indigenous history and culture. I also want to name that this sermon will not be nearly enough to encompass the beauty and complex history of Indigenous peoples, but I do hope it will motivate and inspire all of us to shift our thinking, to listen more deeply, and to embody the changes needed for restoration, reparation, and healing. I often reflect on the words by anti-racist educator Robin DiAngelo, who asks white people to consider the segregation in their lives and world, the way that whiteness is centered in nearly all of our spaces, and how we white folks fail to notice the segregation, let alone see it as a loss of any kind. She writes, "The most profound message of racial segregation may be that the absence of people of color from our lives is no real loss. Not one person who loved me, guided me, or taught me ever conveyed that segregation deprived me of anything of value. I could live my entire life without a friend or loved one of color and not see that as a diminishment of my life." In the case of Indigenous peoples, after forced removal, mass killing, forced re-education that stripped children of their families, language, and culture, our colonist conquering government quite literally segregated them, banishing them into reservations some far away from their original land. I find it telling, as I've thought back to my own education, that we were given one set of facts as our American history, and never really invited to think critically or ask tough questions. Sure, I learned about events like the Trail of Tears and reservations and forced removal, and those events were even labeled as tragic or bad, but I never remember being pushed to question the motive or to understand the painful legacy that still lingers today. It's as if our Western Christian colonial history was the only inevitable outcome, and we've never really been asked to imagine if it could have been different. And we're only recently being asked to imagine how we might begin to make it different moving forward. My 9th grader is taking American history this year, and I was curious and excited to see if their history class and text treated the early Native American colonization, displacement, and genocide any differently. But no, alas, it didn't feel a whole lot different. Perhaps now we might use more correct terms like genocide and extinction and racism, but it still feels removed and sanitized, pages on a text, as history so often is. And history in schools, at least in my child's American history class, is rarely framed as a massive injustice, the impacts of which continue today, but rather as a mere fact of the past. Young people are taught about battles, wars, killings, treaties, removal, without a deeper examination of the consequences then and now. The doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny live as unexplored historical assumptions, and both are still pervasive in our cultural thinking and in our cultural DNA. Here in our own Boise Valley, hundreds of Native Americans were forcibly removed. Treaties were signed that were never ratified, and Native tribes were never paid what was promised. Shoshone Bannock tribal leaders share that in April of 1869, all the Indians were rounded up from Weiser to Boise, a trail of tears from the Boise Valley to Fort Hall. Out of 500 forced to make the trek, only 350 made it to Fort Hall. In a quote from our Unitarian Universalist Association website that explores Indigenous Peoples Day and the doctrine of discovery, We read that beginning with 1823 in the Johnson versus Mintosh decision, the United States Supreme Court has used the doctrine of discovery as the basis for its decision-making. The decision states, discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest. The United States owns indigenous lands. The native people have only the legal right of occupancy. The decision, written by Chief Justice Marshall, further stated, the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Unlike other racist court decisions from the 19th century, this one has never been revisited or overturned. Later cases stated that indigenous peoples were domestic dependent nations of the United States. The Johnson versus Mintosh decision and those that followed continued to be cited in court cases and decisions today. That is frustrating language to read. It smacks of exclusion, narrow thinking, injustice, and an utter lack of imagination. As a brief aside, our Unitarian Universalist Association passed a resolution just in 2012 condemning the doctrine of discovery. I don't share this to let us off the hook in any way, but to point toward ways in which we as Unitarian Universalists are being invited to dismantle deep cultural frameworks, deep cultural wounds, some of them perpetrated by our own ancestors, and thinking about beginning the pathways toward right relationship, healing, and reparation. All this history is wrapped up in the way that our Western settler colonial culture shapes this linear worldview. As part of that historical progress and without consequence. We're conditioned to accept these advances in culture and society as positive outgrowths, and that anything else that might be a departure is labeled unnecessary, silly, antiquated, different, other, un-American, or it's tokenized and appropriated into the latest nouveau spiritual movement or health craze. We are rarely asked to deeply confront what is lost, what we dismiss, or what we extinguish along the way. In the book An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which was our UUA 2019 common read, author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz invites us to consider a fundamental transformation in the way we learn, teach, and think about our history. She writes, writing U.S. history from an indigenous people's perspective requires rethinking the consensual national narrative. That narrative is wrong or deficient, not in its facts, dates, or details, but rather in its essence. Inherent in the myth we've been taught is an embrace of settler colonialism and genocide. The myth persists, not for a lack of free speech or poverty of information, but rather for an absence of motivation to ask questions that challenge the core of the scripted narrative of the origin story. Our history with this tightly held narrative affords us great unearned privilege at the expense of the ongoing oppression of indigenous peoples. In a Yes magazine article, author Kyle PAUITE writes, whether one participates in settler colonialism is not entirely a matter of when or how one's ancestors came to the US. Having settler privilege means that some combination of one's economic security, U.S. citizenship, sense of relationship to the land, mental and physical health, cultural integrity, family values, career aspirations, and spiritual lives are not possible, literally, without the territorial dispossession of Indigenous peoples. As I've wrestled with the reality of these truths and how easy it is for me as a white woman to not have to deal with them in my day-to-day life, I know that I must actively choose a different path. The path of decolonization, the path of pledging to become a good ancestor. Decolonization holds the beliefs and values of restorative and transformative justice, of physical, psychological, and economic freedom, of sovereign independence and self-determination for Native peoples. Decolonization lives in partnership with the work of anti-racism, anti-oppression, and the dismantling of white supremacy, work to which we as a faith and a fellowship have committed ourselves. Decolonization is more than just advocacy and justice. It is a way of being in the world, and it starts within. Those of us non-Indigenous people who carry the Western settler colonial identities and historic privilege can start by asking important questions. Whose country do I live in? What nation? If my land was stolen, my culture and sovereignty denied, what rights would I want, need, and expect? How can we acknowledge and confront ongoing territorial dispossession and the risk to health, economic vitality, to lives and psychological well-being, to cultural integrity that Indigenous people experience? Who on this land, in this country, must I listen to and work with? Embodying decolonization. Embodying is really the best word because it requires our whole self, not just our intellectual minds, but also our hearts of compassion, a spiritual grounding, and a commitment to action. We cannot give back all that was lost and erased, but we can keep asking the question, what is our work in repairing a long and broken history? A helpful frame we can adopt when embodying decolonization is that of becoming a good ancestor. The concept of being a good ancestor runs deep in Indigenous communities, holding the core belief that each action we take must consider the 7 generations that will come after ours, and must honor the legacy, love, and work of the ancestors that came before. I'm not suggesting that those of us who are non-Indigenous folks never consider our own ancestry or fail to employ generational thinking. But our dominant culture narrative pushes so hard against those ideals and so fully toward this rugged individualism and a scarcity thinking, toward exceptionalism, getting the most for ourselves and our tight circle without thinking about the broader interdependent relationship of humanity and the earth. Becoming a good ancestor requires deep listening, this spiritual theme for the month of October. Listening mindfully, but not romantically. Listening to the pain and grief and deep wounds. Receiving and then acting upon the hopes and dreams and visions for the future, even when they seem radical and impossible. It means listening to the younger generations whose passion and commitment are compelling and who see the cracks and threads of connection we might miss. Becoming a good ancestor invites ancestral imagination, an imagination of living into the longing for what could be, as a gift we leave for future generations. And imagining that Indigenous ancestors' belief systems are worthy of saving. Imagining a United States of tribal nations, where land is returned and restored. And imagining that we the people means all the people, especially those that first inhabited this land. Becoming a good ancestor means asking what's best for the whole of creation, not just for my own. It means resisting the extractive culture of free market capitalism and embracing distributive, adaptive, interdependent, decentralized, non-linear, generative models of abundance and belovedness. These are terms that are missing, particularly in this cultural moment. These visions that offer up transformative, creative possibilities for the future. Becoming a good ancestor asks us to hold humanity as beloved kin and to keep all people, especially those on the margins, from being invisible. This orientation requires reciprocity and relationship. We must cultivate authentic, accountable relationships if we are to truly become allies in the movement for lasting change. It feels appropriate to close this sermon with words from an Indigenous voice. This is a quote from Atika Wilbur in her article, "I'm Dreaming About a Modern World That Doesn't Erase Its Indigenous Intelligence." She writes, "I keep having these recurring dreams where I'm on a plane or a train, and all the people around me, native and non-native, are speaking different Indigenous languages. I hear PAUITE, Lahutsid, Dine, Catawba, and they're feeding their babies wild rice and smoked fish. I'm dreaming about a modern world that doesn't erase its Indigenous intelligence, but rather embraces the rich complexity of Indigenous culture. This can be actualized if we all bring our hearts and minds together. The land we walk on is Indian land, whether it be suburban cul-de-sacs or city streets. Echoes of Indian existence are all around us. It's up to us to listen. May it be so." Becoming a good ancestor also means holding the stories, those of the land, of ancient people, those of our beloved community. Our stories are what bind us together. Our stories weave the threads of our lives into a beautiful, colorful tapestry. This is the time in the service when we welcome your stories of joy, of sorrow, of passages in your lives. I want to start by sharing a few joys and sorrows that have come to us, and then you are invited to share yours in the chat and share the blessing of this community to know that none of us journeys through life alone. We hold Anne Sabin and the Sabin family in our hearts as Anne's younger brother died suddenly last week. We hold Jackie Jarbo in our hearts, whose sister-in-law died suddenly. And we celebrate with Karen and Craig Racy as they welcome their new baby granddaughter, Alice June, into the world. As you share your joys and sorrows, as we share our stories in the chat, we also receive the blessing of this Native American flute music composed and performed by Robert Taltree. May we hold the joys and sorrows, the stories of our lives in beloved community together. I invite you into a time of prayer and meditation as we hear Black Elk's prayer on Hinen Kaga from 1931. Let us ready ourselves for prayer by taking a few deep breaths. And as we breathe, I invite you to connect with the ancestry of this land, allowing your hearts and spirits to be called by ancient wisdom as we hear these words of prayer from Oglala Lakota Sioux leader Black Elk. Great mysterious one, grandfather, you have been always, and before you, nothing has been. There is nothing to pray to but you. The star nations all over the universe are yours, and yours are the grasses of the earth. Day in, day out, you are the life of things. You are older than all in need, older than all pain and prayer. Grandfather, all over the world, the faces of living ones are alike. In tenderness, they have come up out of the ground. Look upon your children, with children in their arms, that they may face the winds and walk the good road to the day of quiet. Teach me to walk the soft earth, a relative to all that live. Sweeten my heart and fill me with light. Give me the strength to understand and the eyes to see. Help me, for without you, I am nothing. In the name of all that is holy, we pray. Amen. Our closing song today is called Beyond the Rocks. It features youth from the Sekedene Nation in British Columbia in a project of the Nue Jinan artists. The song was written, recorded, and filmed by the students of the Sekedene School.
Clouds is a place we roam. The land that we burn, our people have drowned in. We've moved all around it. It once was home.
Being haunted by a distant past, redirected down a different path. Our people didn't have a choice. As we're thinking back, is there respect for the land where we fish and trap?
Survivors of the valley, the language lives. Revival of Sakani, tradition gives. Danny's eye, more hope, more medicine, giving us strength for the future to spread our wings.
Beyond the rocks, the shores and trees, heal the wounds, the stars and broken dreams. Broken dreams. Beyond the rocks, there's more to see. The leaders of the valley we're born to be. Born to be.
Deni hako klawi shenowe chidala asai.
Need a little change, try to spark a fire. We can't stay the same. What the heart desires. Smoke signals to the world as it gets higher. Can't say we never made it cause we are survivors.
The young generation, the choice is ours. The voice of a nation, we got the power. As the pain fades away, let it rain and shower. We were the calm before the storm, now we're getting louder.
They say it's all business, I call it destruction. Money breeding greed and causing corruption. Our culture is key and brings honest discussion. Say gay is independent, the truth we're becoming.
Heart numbing past, mind is the the present. Talk to the elders, our eyes are reflected. Fast forward to the now, find your direction. Make better choices, the future's where we're headed.
Beyond the rocks, the shores and trees, to heal the wounds, the stars and broken dreams.
Broken dreams,
Broken dreams.
broken dreams.
Beyond the rocks, there's more to see. The leaders of the valley, we're born to be.
Born to be,
Born to be.
born to be.
Kuke la sha nizanawa, azi dane la ziche.
Every demon that I couldn't hide, all the deadly pain that was buried deep inside was keeping me from finding the only reason I
needed in my life, to share and forgive. Our tradition we live, we will dare to begin. Go beyond all the changes. You fly over mountains, you hear the sacred youth united and shouting. Beyond the rocks, the shores and trees, to heal the wounds, the stars and broken dreams. Broken dreams, broken dreams. Beyond the rocks, there's more to see. The leaders of the valley, we're born to be. Born to be, born to be, born to be. Beyond the rocks, the shores and trees, to heal the wounds, the stars and broken dreams. Broken dreams, broken dreams, broken dreams. Beyond the rocks, there's more to see. The leaders of the valley, we're born to be. Born to be, born to be.
Fabulous video. That video is being shared in several UU congregations this morning, and we were given gracious and excited permission to share it widely from the video project, the Nue Jinan artists, and I put a link to the video in the chat. I invite you to place your hands on your heart for our closing blessing. And before we close, I want to offer a special thanks of gratitude to all of those who made today's service possible, and some first-timers with us today. To Rachel Murphy, a first-time celebrant, thank you. To Lori Watson, our first-time tech host, thank you. And of course, continued thanks for all of your contributions to our community. To Jem, Emerson, Paige, our religious exploration coordinator, and Carie, Bastian, our music director. Our closing blessing this morning, our final words from Joy Harjo, again from Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. 6. And use what you learn to resolve your own conflicts and mediate others' conflicts. We made it back home, back over those curved roads that wind through the city of peace. We stopped at the doorway of dusk as it opened to our homelands. We gave thanks for the story, for all parts of the story, because it was by the light of those challenges we knew ourselves. We asked for forgiveness. We laid down our burdens next to each other. Amen. Blessed are we all. Go in peace. Thank you for joining us today, everyone.